Good evening and welcome to Overtime here on WOTM. I'm Gerhard Mathangani. We're joining you for the next 1 hour talking everything in the world of sports, including the SEC Championship game and National Signing Day, which was a big one for teams in our state. Like I said, Gerhard Mathangani today, joined by a friend of ours, Mark Everett Kelly, back in the house. And Mark, we're going to get a lot of insight from you about the upcoming SEC Championship game. You are a resident sports historian, and you deal a lot with the stats. You dove deep into this game, and that's exactly where we will start with the Alabama and Florida game, playing once again for the SEC Championship. Let me ask you big picture before we dive into the numbers. In your opinion, has this game lost a bit of its shine because of the fact that, you know, we're in a situation where Auburn fires his head coach, National Signing Day is today, and we have Alabama and a Florida team that 2 weeks ago looked like this is going to be two teams that could play for a college football championship, and now it doesn't have that same luster.
Yeah, I had written a couple of weeks ago, you essentially had the playoff before the playoff on Saturday the 19th because you had Clemson and Notre Dame playing each other, and then you would have had Florida and Alabama playing each other. And in my opinion, they are the four best teams, were the four best teams in the country going into last weekend. But because Florida lost in a way that I guess would be throwing a shoe type of mad. I don't know. That was such a hard way to lose a game to accept. And you saw it even in where they fell. They only fell one spot in the rankings, and that kind of confused everybody. Joey Galloway was convinced there's a conspiracy about the SEC, even though we know the SEC is better than all the other conferences. That was still odd to see them go down just one point when they lose at home to a team that's under 500. That Alabama just, you know, by the time halftime was at Alabama game, you had guys, you know, appealing to go in because it was like 55 points in the first half.
Right, exactly. And so in this situation, like you said, you do have a Florida team that throughout the course of the season, I mean, give Florida their credit.
Yeah,
even though we're upset with them now, throughout the course of the season, they've been really strong
Very
offensively.
good. They were the only team I thought that could match Alabama point for point.
That's right.
Because Trask has had an outstanding season. He set the SEC record for most touchdowns in a 10-game span. He has more than Joe Burrow had last year at this time, 40 to 38. He's thrown for a Florida record as far as yards per game. They're setting, you know, both Alabama and Florida. They're breaking banks offensively. They're both great offenses. You didn't expect them to lose in a spot like this. That would have been a really great game to watch, not just for Florida or Alabama fans, but for any fan of the SEC, because these are two of the I thought were the two of the best teams. I do think Texas A&M has you know, a case to make, but they don't have to make it because they lost to Alabama, and now, you know, I do think they're going to be hurt by the less games because I think if they could have played more games, that would have helped them in an argument against Ohio State, but they couldn't get those games scheduled. But I would say this, the SEC did the right thing. They tried to play.
Exactly.
They didn't take the way out and get a handout like the ACC did, creating a rule so that Notre Dame and Clemson didn't have to play. Because then what if they lost like Florida did? Hey, at least they played.
Right, exactly. And we'll dive into a lot of that deeper into our show. But as we take a look now, we'll take a look at some of your research here as you dove into this game and kind of the side-by-side statistics with both these teams. Alabama and Florida going into this game, over 40 points per game. Going into this matchup, and as you said, one of the only teams that could score overall with Alabama was a team in Florida. And we're taking a look at the SEC Championship preview. We'll take a look at the season stats overall. We'll get into the national recruiting a little bit later in our program. But as of right now, the Alabama and Florida matchup is really interesting because you have a team that's 10-0 and a team that's 8-2, and you have a difference in points per game scored, and the difference in the point differential overall. What did your numbers tell you about this matchup?
Well, Alabama, they scored. I mean, look, Alabama has had some great offenses the last 3 years. The last 3 years, they've really taken the next step where they've averaged over 40 points a game. They've averaged over 500 yards a game. This year, they set a team record 49.5 points per game. They're beating teams by an average of 32.6 points per game. And Florida's not in that class. Their point per game differential is a little bit less, but they're scoring 41 points a game too. Their defense isn't as strong. It's stronger than it was. Like Alabama's, it got better as the season went on, But I don't think anybody could have thought that they would have had the kind of game they did against an LSU offense that really didn't show they were capable of doing what they did against Florida, against Alabama.
Right, and it's great when you compare these two teams side by side. They do have a lot of mutual statistics that look really good. One thing going for Alabama in this matchup, though, is third down efficiency. They're number one in the country in third down efficiency right now.
59%.
As of right now, exactly, 59%, 65 of 110, keeping those chains moving along. That, to me, in my perspective, it's not necessarily big in this game, but it is as they move forward, as they play maybe two more bigger games in the college football playoff.
Well, look, what Alabama does is they basically beat you to death because you realize you have to score with them. And by the first, I did a comparison. The first 7 possessions of each of their games, they're scoring on 67% of them. Touchdowns.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So by that time, you're playing catch-up. And when you're playing catch-up against Alabama, it's like chasing your tail.
Exactly. So Alex Leatherwood, the Alabama offensive lineman, and Alabama head coach Nick Saban addressed the third down success, like Mark said, over 50% on third down, 59, leading the country, and they talked about what makes them so successful on that down.
I think we're effective on third down because of our execution. Third down here is a completely different ball game for us, and we just try to lock in and do our best to execute and get the first down.
I think it goes back to the fundamental execution, whatever the play is called, the routes that are run, the quarterback reads, the offensive line picking up protection, blitzes, whatever. I think it's a combination of all those things that come down to fundamental execution, receivers getting open, quarterback making accurate throws, reading the right things, and I think we've done a really good job from a coaching staff standpoint, Sark and the offensive coaches, of having a good plan for third down in terms of what do they do, how can we sort of know what they're in, get a little pre-snap read, and be able to get adjust the routes to be able to beat it.
I think we're effective on third down.
Another thing that you looked at, Mark, was the
execution.
overall meetings and
here.
results between the teams that have played for the most times in the SEC championship game, and the meeting that we've seen the most is the one we'll see on Saturday, Alabama and Florida going at it for the 10th time.
Yeah, Alabama, Florida, the 10th time. Florida, the last 5 times they played in this conference championship game, they've played Alabama. They seem to draw the short straw. But they've had some great matchups. Looking back, they've served, when you look at how Saban's done against the East, he really hasn't lost many games at all.
Right.
One of those was in 2008, which was the first SEC championship game he played in with Alabama.
Exactly. So you take a look at all the other matchups. You have the LSU-Georgia matchup, which has always been interesting, and then Alabama and Georgia. Arkansas and Florida has met a couple of times. Yeah. Auburn, Tennessee, and then LSU and Tennessee. So an interesting game coming up on Saturday, and we will talk a little bit more about not only the game, but dive deep into some of the Alabama aspects of the championship game as we come back here on Overtime. So we will look at Alabama specifically in this matchup, and Alabama quarterback Mac Jones, who's had a sensational season so far. We'll take a look at that coming up next here on Overtime. Welcome back to Overtime here on WOTM. I'm Gerhard Mathangani, joined by Mark Everett Kelly. We take a look at the SEC championship game. We will focus now on the Alabama Crimson Tide. First, on the offensive side of the ball, since 2018, not just this season, but there's been a seismic change in what Alabama's done on offense. And you take a look at guys like Jalen Hurts, Tua Tagovailoa, and then now with Mac Jones. And as you take a look at some of your numbers and take a look at just what you're seeing on the field, it's been unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, look, Alabama could always score on you, but they used to do it slowly, and they would do it painfully, and you get a million cuts, and then by the end of the game, you still lose by 30.
Right.
But now they do it where they could score at any time, any place on the field. You look at since 2018, and that was Tua's first full year. He had been there in 2017, helped them win a national championship. Jalen Hurts came back in 2018, but it was Tua's team.
Right.
And you saw just a kind of a different offense with Alabama, a quick scoring offense. They have 62 touchdowns of 30 yards or longer in 3 years.
Wow.
Okay? And, I mean, these aren't just, pass it to the wide receiver and then he runs.
Right.
I mean, as great as Devontae Smith is and Jerry Jeudy and all those guys, They are so wide open. All their wide receivers are so wide open. Najee Harris is running through big holes. They have great chemistry and camaraderie on offense, but that's because they have outstanding athletes. You see it with the players they recruited today. That's something that they implemented, but now these guys can, with Tua, he could really pass the ball and convert those long passes, and same thing with Mac Jones.
And I think what's really dynamic and really interesting about this team and about the offense overall, it changed with the times. It started really, I would say probably in the Big 12 and in the Pac-12, you had a lot of emphasis on quarterbacks and getting strong, dynamic receivers, and then now you're starting to see that with Alabama as well.
Alabama's took it to a ridiculous level. I mean, you look at the wide receiver tandems they had last year with Jerry Jeudy and Ruggs. I mean, for first round guys who are probably going to be all pros and maybe Hall of Famers.
Right.
And then you have Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle. I mean, these guys were backups last year.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And even when they lost Waddle, who, if you look, Waddle is averaging 20.3 yards per touch, which would rank first in the SEC. He had over 400-something yards in the 5 games that he played, and he was returning punts. And then you saw with Smith this weekend returning punts. All these guys are so talented. Smith is a playmaker.
Right.
So while I don't know if he's going to win the Heisman, he certainly could. But I think, obviously, he's the best player in the SEC because whenever Alabama really needs a play, he's there.
Exactly.
I mean, you saw that catch he made against LSU in the back of the end zone when it looked like Mac Jones was throwing that ball away. Those are the types of plays he can make. Najee kind of just beats you to death.
Right.
And when they want to beat you to death, they use him. And then with Mechie, they can beat you long. And then with Waddle, they had another guy like that, too. Slade Bolden can do that a little bit, not as good, but there's just 4-star, 5-star recruits, guys that can run to 40 and 3.9 probably. But that's why their offense has gone to a different level. And with these types of athletes that they have, a wide receiver and running back, that's why they create match problems everywhere. So you cannot defend them.
You mentioned Mac Jones. We'll take a look at some of his numbers. Going both in the SEC and overall in the FBS, where he stands right now, it's kind of elite territory overall. I mean, the worst number on this is 5th in the touchdown race when it comes to the country overall. He's been sensational this year.
Well, I mean, who do you give the Heisman to? There's 3 guys you could legitimately give the Heisman to on Alabama. It could have been Waddle too. But Devontae Smith, he's the best player. It's kind of like, do we give the MVP to Jordan? No. Okay, we'll give it to somebody else.
Right.
All right. So Alabama quarterbacks never won an MVP, a Heisman Trophy for Alabama, and they've had the first 3 Super Bowl MVPs. Joe Namath, Bart Starr. They never, Ken Stabler. They never won a Heisman Trophy.
Right.
But Mac Jones could. He's in a position too. I think he should, because the other thing you got to remember about Mac Jones that why Tua didn't win it is because Alabama's blowing teams out. They're not playing deep into the 4th quarter where every possession they have to score. Alabama takes the second half off in most of these games.
Exactly.
So his statistics, you see only 27 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. That could be even better. He could have 40 touchdowns if they played with that type of intensity every down.
Exactly, and also if he played throughout the course of the
whole game.
And there's a lot of games that he's only played a little bit.
Right.
Flipping now to the Alabama defense, talked a lot about the offense, but that Alabama defense, they've really turned it on here as of late. And it looks like there's kind of like a line of demarcation with this defense. And I think it might have been the Ole Miss game, and they with everybody who was so concerned about the defense going into it, those problems have kind of been eradicated.
Well, I mean, really when it started was at halftime against Georgia.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the anti-Tennessee, where Tennessee went into halftime against Georgia and they absolutely disappeared.
Right.
Alabama came out against Georgia and they outscored them in the second half like they always tend to do against Georgia, is they dominate down the stretch. They held Georgia scoreless in the second half. They had a few turnovers that really turned the tide of that game. Jalen Waddle had a huge touchdown pass by Mac Jones to put them ahead. Since then, their defense has been absolutely lights out. They've held teams to only 8.3 points per game in their last 6 games when they were averaging almost just under 30 points per game, allowing over 458 yards per game with that big blow up against Ole Miss when everybody, couldn't recognize this Alabama defense. But
and I talked to a lot of Alabama people who were just freaking out about this defense, and like you said, they've turned it around.
Well, I think people were still mad at the end of last year when they lost to Auburn, and they really dominated Auburn offensively like nobody else could do. Auburn had a good defense last year. Nobody did to Auburn what Alabama did to them and what Mac Jones. That's how you kind of knew Mac Jones was going to be really good, because he really had his way against Auburn. If it weren't for those 2 pick sixes, they would have ran that game. They could have put 60 up on them.
No doubt.
Right?
And one of the big things I took away from your stats is overall touchdowns allowed, 4 over in the last 6 games.
Right.
To me, that shows the complete dominance, and also they're not allowing some of these garbage touchdowns. A lot of times what ends up happening is you'll get some of these backup defenders in the game late, and they'll give up a touchdown or 2. And in Alabama's case, they put that second string in, and they've been just as phenomenal.
Well, they did in one of those games, and I saw Saban kind of lose it on the sideline. It was the Auburn game, I think. Remember when they fumbled?
Yeah.
And then I wouldn't have wanted to be heading back to the sideline. We were talking about how nice he looks in his Christmas sweater. You wonder how the players get when he gets, they dominate so much. He's got to create things to get on him.
Yeah.
But that's why they're as good as they are, because there's accountability. The second string, they come in, they have plays to run. These guys are playing real, but these guys are guys that could play and start on just about every other team in the SEC. Forget about in college football, in the elite premier conference. That's the other thing. Alabama's doing this against the best conference in college football.
Yeah.
They are winning by almost 20-something points per game, putting up 500 yards per game, putting up almost 50 points per game against the best conference in college football, where you have guys routinely first-round picks every year go to the NFL.
Right, and they're seemingly only getting better, which is actually scarier going into this matchup against Florida and the SEC championship game. Well, coming up next here on Overtime, what we'll do is we'll switch over to the Auburn side of things. They're done with their regular season. However, there's still a lot to take care of in the postseason, whether it's recruiting, finding a new coach, lots of stuff going on down on the Plains. We'll talk with Mark about that coming up next. Welcome back to Overtime here on WOTM. Gerhard Mathangani joined by Mark Everett Kelly. Now, Mark, let's go on to the Auburn side of things. Kevin Steele is a name that has popped up as one of the serious contenders now for this Auburn football job. Your thoughts overall about maybe Auburn going and in between the old coach and Gus Malzahn and the new coach? Do you like the idea of Kevin Steele?
Well, I don't really know what else they could have wanted Gus Malzahn to do.
Right.
I mean, Alabama only has 8 losses since 2011. 3 of them are against Auburn. They've won 3 SEC West titles. They've won a national championship. They played for the national championship in 2014. So, I mean, you're not going to beat Alabama every year.
Right.
You're not going to be better than Alabama. I mean, it might be hard for Auburn fans to hear, but that's not a put down. Okay, when you've beaten them more than anybody else, that's pretty good.
Right.
So I thought he did a pretty good job. Well, I don't understand what they're asking him to do better than what he's done. Now, maybe a 6-4 season when you lose to South Carolina and you have 2 other games that really you should have lost, that the referees later say you did lose, but they made mistakes. That I could understand. That maybe it's kind of like the Eli Manning thing with the Giants. Eli Manning was there when you needed him, won 2 Super Bowls, but the consistency he lacked.
Right.
So Auburn maybe year to year doesn't have that kind of consistency. I mean, the SEC shorts guys do a great job of kind of pointing that out, but it's true. So maybe that, but again, what do you really want? You've won 3 division titles when nobody really wins division titles except for specific teams now. They are one of them.
Right.
They've won more division titles than anybody else outside of LSU and Alabama.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people kind of see that Auburn job that way, and sometimes Auburn fans see it a little bit differently going into the matchup. So we heard for the first time from Kevin Steele today, but he kept it more so about early signing day, and that was kind of the motif of the press conference today. They made sure to say to all the reporters on the Zoom call, it wasn't in real life obviously, they made sure to say, hey, look, we're going to keep this about a signing day. However, he did address the quick turnaround and losing a coach right in the middle of a really tough stretch here as Auburn gets ready for his bowl game and tries to recruit at the same time.
Poor guy.
This is the first thoughts from Kevin Steele today during signing day's press conference.
The fact that the change happened a couple of days before signing day was a big challenge for the staff in its own right, in that recruiting without a head coach to the final 3 days to signing date was certainly a challenge with that. And that brings me to a point. I think I'd be remiss if I did not say that we appreciate Coach Malzahn, what he did for Auburn University. The staff, the players appreciate his leadership. They appreciate the way that he led this program and treated us while he was here. And we wish he and his family nothing but the best.
Mark, your thoughts on Coach Steele and kind of what Auburn's having to deal with right now?
Merry Christmas. You get 24 recruits signed by Alabama, and now you got to step into that and kind of answer to the best recruiting class in the nation. Probably not the best Christmas gift.
Yeah, it's definitely hard, and now Auburn is trying to do one of two things. They're still trying to fill out the 2021 signing class, but then also they will have a bowl game in order to prepare for, and Coach Kevin Steele will be a major part of that. Obviously, Auburn doesn't know what bowl they'll be playing in until this upcoming weekend after the games are all settled in with the conference championship games. However, there's still a lot to be done there. So it's like Merry Christmas. On the other side of the state, they're humming over there. But as for Auburn, it's a tough road, and we'll also look at the signing day stuff coming up next year on our program. We will start with the Crimson Tide, as Mark said, had a phenomenal day as they get ready to play for a conference championship. Looking now to the future guys, they're trying to win conference and national championships. We'll take a look at the Crimson Tide's signing class on the first day of the early signing period coming up next year on Overtime. Welcome back to Overtime here on WOTM. Mark, a lot of college football fans really love this day because it's the first day of signing period in the early period, and this started a few years ago, and now it's kind of taken over the February signing period. I think a lot of the guys that are some of the blue chip recruits wanted to get everything over with. However, you put it right in the middle of December, it doesn't have that same flair that it does right before the Super Bowl or right after the Super Bowl, depending on the year. Your take overall from Alabama. Alabama signed the top player in the state of Alabama, Kool-Aid McKinstry. You saw him right here on WOTM in a couple of different ways, winning a state championship with Pinson Valley, also winning the MVP of the Alabama-Mississippi All-Star Game. Alabama once again coming up with a big class, and McKinstry, the five-star, the number one cornerback in the country, another one of those players, one of those guys.
Well, the other thing they do is they get a lot of offensive linemen. I mean, big quality offensive linemen. You look at the states that they recruit from, they have 5 from Florida, 5 from Texas, the hot spots for college football, and they're able to keep their own, 5 from Alabama. You need to be able to do that. They do that every year. Getting a top 5 class for Alabama isn't anything new. All these guys are sensational athletes. They don't, the guys that really have a position in high school, sometimes they might change. Saban gets them, and it turns out that they were a cornerback in high school. They're better wide receiver, or maybe they're a better linebacker now because so many of these linebackers have more skills, pass coverage skills. You're going to need them now. But all these guys, the one thing they have in common, they are all phenomenal athletes.
Exactly, and McKinstry is one of the plenty of 5 stars that they have on that team. As we take a look at the class overall, and we break down the class, 24 overall signees, 10 on offense, including, as you said, 4 offensive linemen. They always fill that position, including the top 2 tackles in the country. We'll take a look at that in a moment. Also a quarterback, 4 receivers. That's another place that Alabama's been dominating here lately. 14 players overall defensively, 6 5-stars, 14 4-stars, and 3 3-stars. The number one recruiting class across the board between 24/7 Sports, ESPN, and Rivals. Like you said, just a banner day once again for Coach Nick Saban and that staff.
Yeah, and they were also able to steal one of the guys from LSU, so you have a one-up on them. Where Ed Oregon's, what he kind of stuck it to Alabama a couple of years ago with the Roll Tide. Well, then they kind of got him back today by taking one of his prize recruits. And the other thing is that you see Mac Jones have all this time to pass, and that's really a thing that goes unrecognized. Is these big horses that they get every year. Every year Alabama's got great offensive line, And that's really what you need. And you do it because guys like the Brockenmeyers, those guys look kind of scary. Some of these names, too. I mean, it's kind of hard. I was listening to some of these guys as I try to pronounce some of these names, DeQuincy and, Deontay. So some of them, if you don't really know them beforehand, you get to botch their names pretty good. But
right.
They did pretty good.
Yeah, and you take a look at some of the notable players from the 2021 signing class. They had the number 1 and number 2 offensive tackle. You talk about protecting your quarterback. You can't do any better than J.C. Latham and the guy you mentioned earlier, Tommy Brockermeyer. They also got Tommy Brockermeyer's brother, who is the number 1 center, one of the top centers in the country, a 4-star prospect. But here's all the 5 stars. They got Dallas Turner, the number 8 overall player and the number 1 weak side defensive end. They also got Damon Payne, the number 19 overall player for the 2021 class, and the number 3 defensive tackle. Kool-Aid McKinstry, a guy you saw highlights of, the number 1 corner in America, and the number 23 player overall. Ja'Cory Brooks, number 34 overall, and the number 2 wide receiver. And then they got Deontay Lawson. He was edging towards Florida, but he's from Mobile Christian, a guy that played on a couple of state championship teams, teams that made it to the state championship game, number 55 overall, and the number 3 inside linebacker in the country. And as you pointed out, got 5 players from the state of Alabama, and then you also mentioned 5 from Texas and 5 from Florida. Also picked around the country a little bit as well. 2 from Maryland, 1 from Georgia, 1 from Louisiana, 1 from Michigan, Mississippi, Ohio, South Carolina, and Wisconsin. I think once again overall, you're taking a look at just another class that Alabama is now showing that they can dominate in state, getting the top players in state, but then also this is a national program. You think about places like Texas. You don't have to recruit the nation in Texas. There's 300 top 500 players.
Take your pick.
In a couple of those states. Places like Alabama have now turned into this national recruiting base where you just can go anywhere and go get these players.
Well, also JoJo Earl they got, which was a real steal for them. They didn't think they were going to get him. Keanu Coate, he's the guy that they got from LSU that he basically took him right out of their defensive line because he's going to be a heck of an outside linebacker, a guy that can really put pressure on a quarterback. And Agaye Hall was another wide receiver that they got too. So they're replacing these guys, all these great guys that are always so wide open. The Jerry Judys and the Mechis and the Jalen Waddles.
Right.
Here comes in another group of them.
Exactly. Alabama head coach Nick Saban usually has his own signing day press conference, and he just talks about the signing day. But as you mentioned, he's got a game to prepare for as well. So he talked about signing day after practice preparations for the SEC championship game. Here's what he said about the 2021 signing class so far.
This is the 4th year of the early signing period. Probably a little more challenging this year than in most years because of the absence of being able to have contact. But a lot of people did a really, really good job. You know, we recruit as a team here at Alabama. We get a lot of support in the university community. You know, we spend a tremendous amount of time on Zooms and videos to sort of create relationships that we didn't have the opportunity to create by, normal visits. But, we identified the needs that we had in this class early on. I think we, got some really good players at each one of those positions. And, we're really pleased to have this group of players become a part of our program and a part of our team.
So once again, another banner day for Alabama on the recruiting trail. Next up, we'll flip over to the Auburn side. Kevin Steele looking to solidify a remnants of a class here in the early stages. Didn't get as many players as Alabama. We'll break down the Auburn Tigers coming up next. Welcome back to Overtime here on WOTM. I'm Gerhard Mathangani, and I'm also joined by Mark Everett Kelly, who is with us once again. We're now breaking down the Auburn football recruiting class. And as we talked about earlier, with so much uncertainty at head coach, and Kevin Steele has even admitted to this, Auburn struggled on the opening day of the early signing period. Mark, overall, let's take a look at their numbers just in general. 12 overall signees, 5 on offense and 7 on defense. They didn't get any 5 stars according to the 24/7 rankings, which is what we use. Also 4 stars and 8 3 stars. And then you see the rankings overall. ESPN has some top 25, but number 46 according to 24/7, which I think is the one that a lot of people use because they have the composite rankings, and then rivals in the 50s at number 52. Your thoughts about this Auburn class overall, struggling out of the gate here on the opening day of signing period?
Well, I mean, a lot of this can be based on where you get who we're getting the recruiting information from.
Right.
Because there's so many different guys that do it. They have a different set of criteria that they base it on. So one could be weighed a certain way and another way. There's really, you can't really go by, well, this guy was this in this magazine, so this is better than the other one. There's a lot that goes into these guys becoming college football players. A lot has to do with where they go, the type of program they go into, how they're developed.
Right.
So you can have the greatest athlete, you can have guys that were a 3-star guy or a 4-star guy. I mean, really, there's really not that much of a difference. If you looked at how they balanced that and said, well, this guy's 3 stars, this guy's 4 stars, you could flip a coin and probably get a better ratio than you would by how they judge it. So it's really just based on people's opinion.
Exactly.
So basically what happens when they come to Auburn, if they get the type of leadership and the type of training and development, these guys can be better than they were recruited to be.
Right.
Based on what some kind of scout that really is making a judgment that they don't. All these guys only have a specific amount of time, and if you're not an elite class athlete, they're just kind of going on secondhand information most of the time.
Right.
So
and
you can get a good player that slips under the radar.
And that was kind of Tommy Tuberville's bread and butter, being able to take a guy that maybe rated as a 3-star by some of the recruiting sites, but then also being able to develop him. Next thing you know, he's a first, second, third round draft pick in the NFL. Meanwhile, coming up for the Tigers, some notable players here. Taking a look at some of the guys that they were able to get in this class. Lee Hunter was kind of the main prize. He was the top rated player for Auburn's class. A big guy, 6'5", 290 pounds, out of Pritchard, Alabama. Then also they had a quarterback. In every class, you need at least one quarterback, and unless you just have an embarrassment of riches at that position. But Demetrius Davis out of Houston, Texas, signing with the Tigers. Also Amari Harvey, a defensive back out of Tallahassee, Florida. Garner Langlow, also a 3-star athlete. He was out of Ocala, Florida, 6'7", 280 pounds. So you take a look at the class overall and some of their measurables, and it looks like it can be a class where, of these 12 players, now these 12 players essentially become extensions of the assistant coaches and try to get some other guys because they'll have some scholarships available. I think a lot of these players that you see on your screen and some of the players that are a part of this class will now have to start recruiting some of these guys that are undecided right now.
Well, it's just like in college basketball. You have your programs like Duke and Kentucky where you're not going to get these guys for 4 years. Some of these other schools, they recruit guys for the long game. And these are guys you can develop, so by the time they get to be juniors, seniors, they're a lot better than they were coming in as freshmen. So that goes into it too when you're recruiting. The guys that go out and do these recruiting trips, it's not fun to go do a recruiting trip. You're staying at like a Hotel 8, and you're getting bad food. So a lot of times these guys are up against it, but they put a lot of time into this, and if they think they can develop a guy and kind of see them get better as they go along and their junior and senior year really get something out of them, that's kind of what these I don't want to say secondary schools because you're in the SEC and you got to compete, but they're playing the long game. They're not in that recruiting battle to get the top guys. They're looking to get guys they can develop.
Exactly. Auburn interim head coach Kevin Steele had his signing day press conference today, and here's what he said about the 2021 class so far.
These guys, these 12, they showed a commitment to Auburn University that is the kind of commitment you want in the fourth quarter in the Iron Bowl. They did not waver, and they were committed to finish for Auburn, and that's huge. All in all, on offense, that makes 5 signees. We lost 1. We've got 3 holding. On defense, that's 7 signees. We will add 1 Friday for the 8th. And then we have 2 holding. So numbers-wise, so that you can have that, is we signed 12, and technically speaking, there's 11 more spots on the books that could be filled, and so that would be up to the next head coach.
So that was Kevin Steele on the recruiting class there. Meanwhile, we'll go flip to the national recruiting classes overall. We'll take a look at that coming up next here on Overtime. Welcome back to Overtime here on WOTM. We talked about Auburn and Alabama's specific recruiting classes, and now we're in a situation, we'll go nationwide. It's not a coincidence, I would think, that a lot of times when you take a look at the college football rankings, if you just look at the recruiting rankings from 2, 3, 4 years before, they a lot of times mirror one another. So let's take a look at what the 2021 class has in store. We talked about Alabama, #1 overall, and then some of the mainstays there in our top 10.
Ohio State, Georgia, LSU, a lot of SEC schools, a lot of Big Ten schools on here, a couple Pac-12 schools, because they're realizing they are falling back a little, the Pac-12.
Right.
They haven't had a team make the playoff for a little while. They don't really get mentioned like the Big Ten does and the SEC does, or even the Big 12 does. And the Big 12 is kind of taking a step back. You look at how they got blown out last year. Oklahoma got blown out. Really wasn't even a game against against LSU. So it could. You have to be able to recruit and know who you're recruiting against.
Right.
If you're going to go after these top guys.
Right.
And you're going to hit and miss with some of them, but a lot of these early signings is key to really making sure that, because sometimes you get one guy, that leads to getting 4 other guys.
Right.
So that can be a really good sign.
Exactly. Notre Dame leading the list of overall signees today with 25, kind of harping on that momentum that they have rolling right now as one of the top 4 teams in the country playing for an ACC championship. Florida also with 26. They're able to add a few more. They were able to get some JUCO guys as well as a guy from the state of Alabama. Alabama with 24 signees as well, and Michigan with 20. Meanwhile, let's dive into the SEC. All the teams in the SEC came in the top 50 overall in the country, and you take a look at some of the ones that Auburn was able to get. Auburn is down there with Vanderbilt and Kentucky. You don't see that a lot, but then some of your overall impressions with teams like Texas A&M, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Missouri, all in the top 30 in this year's signing class so far.
Well, you saw Arkansas really play very well early on. They were one of the teams that kind of was victimized in the Auburn thing, where they maybe could have won that game. The same thing with Ole Miss. They were the other team. So Arkansas has got a lot to build off of. Tennessee, you wonder what's going to happen with Jeremy Pruitt, because they really were supposed to do something this year. Texas A&M. Now, before the season started, I had Alabama 10-0, and I had Texas A&M at 9-1. And those were really the only things I got right in the SEC West.
Right.
Okay. And then the SEC East, I had Florida at 9-1 and Georgia at 8-2, because I thought Florida was better. They were going to beat Georgia. So I got some of that. I got the top right, but the bottom I didn't really do so well on. It's kind of hard to do those middle
Right.
teams. That's kind of where you really separate the men from the boys. But also in recruiting, Texas A&M, if they're good to play with Alabama consistently, you got to recruit with Alabama consistently. We know Jimbo Fisher's a big-time coach, so you know he can get the guys in there. But he's in a tough spot in that division with LSU. That's a hard thing to kind of compete and know you got to produce. Look, every year Alabama's going to get a top 5 recruiting class.
Exactly.
You have to do that if you want to win. Same thing with Ole Miss. And now they're realizing, Lane Kiffin's realizing, oh my God, I got to do this every year. You know, even though he's an offensive genius, that's kind of hard to do.
No doubt. Finally, we'll take a look at the college football playoff rankings. We talked about this with John yesterday. I want to touch base with you really short here, 90 seconds. Let's talk about what you saw overall, some of your overall thoughts about what the committee saw in the top 4. Ohio State obviously getting some grumblings there as a top 4 team, and Iowa State at number 6.
I don't understand. I really don't understand why you have a team that's only played in 5 games and didn't even qualify according to their own rules for their own conference championship. They had to break the loop. It's like we're dealing with election security here. I mean, why have rules if you're not going to stick by them?
Right.
You can't just waive them and be like, oh, okay, well, it doesn't really matter now because we're Ohio State. Look, whether it was Alabama or whether it's Michigan or anybody, you need rules, you need laws, you need some sort of semblance of criteria to base something on, because if I'm Indiana, I'm pretty ticked that I'm 6-1 and I don't get to go to the conference championship game. When they do, you can't assume that they won't lose. So 5-0 doesn't mean that you get, oh, we'll give you a handout to get to the championship game.
Right, and Florida dropping 1 spot and Cincinnati dropping 1 spot. It's one of those things.
No, Cincinnati.
I feel like the committee just overall
goodbye. Yeah.
They're infuriating because you don't know week to week what they're judging as the number one overall criteria. I do think they have the top three right just because college football's angled itself that way. After that, it's really kind of a crapshoot, and we'll see what they do after the conference championship games coming up this weekend. Speaking of those games, that is exactly what we will talk about coming up next here on Overtime. We'll close up shop taking a look at this weekend's conference championship games. Welcome back to Overtime here on WOTM. Closing up shop here. Mark, let's talk about our conference championship games coming up this week. Lots of interesting storylines, especially as it relates to the Big Ten. The SEC has kind of lost a little bit of its shine. The ACC, though, I think will be the most watched game in the country.
Well, the ACC is essentially a playoff game. Look, if Clemson loses, they're out, because then they would have 2 losses. And Clemson, everybody knows they're one of the better teams. Talk about eye test, okay? They would have 2 losses. They would automatically be eliminated. Notre Dame, even if they lose, you figure they're safe because they beat Clemson early in the year. They're okay. Alabama, even if they lose, they're probably not going to be affected, and they'll stay in the playoff. The big thing is with Ohio State. So if Ohio State loses, they are done, and Texas A&M will then come in. Right. Same thing with Clemson. Those are the only 2 ways I see Texas A&M getting in is if either Clemson loses or Ohio State loses.
Right.
Because Alabama and Notre Dame are safe. Look, what I thought they should have done is I really thought that Ohio State should be playing Texas A&M, and that's who you should be playing now.
Right.
Indiana should be playing Northwestern for the Big Ten championship game, and Cincinnati, and then the winner of Cincinnati, if Cincinnati and Coastal Carolina win their games, they can play on the 26th.
Right.
And take the winner of that game and put them in a better bowl.
No doubt. Yes or no question. If Cincinnati blows Tulsa out, do they have a shot?
No.
Oh, I don't think so either. And sad to say, but I think they're too far out of it.
Blowing out Tulsa.
As of right now.
I could beat up an old lady, but that won't get me much.
Mark, you're doing great work. Tell the good people where they can find your work and be able to find some of the things that you're working on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, well, a lot of how I support myself is through my website, ckmagicsports.com. I have on Patreon, I have my GoFundMe, but that's really how writers like me, that's the only way we can support ourselves. And if there's no other way, because being a cancer survivor, there's a limited amount of things I could do, and I spend a lot of time doing these things. I spent so much time doing the article this week. I love doing it, but really, I can't stress enough, that's a real big way for people to say thank you to me and help support me. If they want to sponsor me, I use that too. My website, I've written a book on surviving cancer because I live with 2 chronic diseases. So there's a lot of people that deal with this stuff. I try to do it the best I can, but there's constant worry for finances because there is no consistency with that.
Right.
So even though I love doing this isn't something I get paid for.
Yeah.
So the only way that I could make a living off it is if I have support from people and if I have people come and sponsor me. So if you're interested in sponsoring me and learning how you can help more people to deal with and live with chronic diseases that really can't provide for themselves unless they're able to do things like this that they're good at. You know that reading any of my stuff that I put a lot of time into it, and I work really hard, and I'll always do that.
And the links are also on those pages as well. So when you do have those articles, you take a look at those articles. The links are on the pages, the Patreon,
Worldwide Sports,
as well as everything else that you do. CK Magic Sports, you're doing great work. Thank you so much for joining us here. Mark Everett Kelly, our sports historian, breaking down everything in the SEC. Well, we hope you have a great weekend and watching the football games this week. We will see you next time here on Overtime.